Black janitor saves a child from fire. That's how the headlines would read the next morning. But on this night, in the dead silence of Ashton Tower, nobody saw the flames yet. Nobody saw the danger growing behind those glittering glass walls. Nobody saw the man who would risk everything to save a life. Marcus Hill was cleaning the lobby floor of the 20-story corporate building, like he did every night. He was a quiet man, proud of his work even though few ever noticed him. His hands were rough, his back ached, but he carried himself with dignity. The kind of man who believed that doing the right thing didn't need an audience. The building was empty except for him and a few security guards. It was past midnight, and the world outside had gone still. That's when Marcus smelled it, faint at first. Then sharp and unmistakable, smoke. He looked up. A thin gray wisp curled along the ceiling near the elevator shaft. Then came the sound, soft crackling, growing louder with every second. He dropped his mop instantly. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Marcus rushed toward the source, his boots echoing on the polished floor. By the time he reached the 10th floor, the hallway was already thick with smoke. His eyes watered, his lungs burned, but he pushed through. The sprinklers hadn't gone off. The alarms stayed silent, just the roar of flames and the sound of his heartbeat. Then he heard it, a faint cry, small, fragile. A child's voice, trapped somewhere in the chaos. His heart froze. There shouldn't have been any children in the building at that hour. But the cry came again, muffled, desperate. He followed the sound into one of the executive offices. The door was hot to the touch, the metal handle burning against his palm. Inside, the room glowed with orange and red, walls melting, smoke swirling like a storm. And there, in the corner near a fallen chair, was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 7, her small hands covering her face as she coughed violently. Her tiny body shook in fear. Marcus didn't think. He moved. He wrapped his jacket around his hands, pushed through the flames, and lifted the debris trapping her. The air was unbreathable. His skin blistered from the heat. But he didn't stop. With one arm, he grabbed the girl and covered her mouth with his sleeve. The fire roared behind them as he forced the door open. The hallway ceiling cracked, raining sparks and ash. Each step felt like a mile. The heat followed him like a living thing, determined to swallow them both. Down the emergency stairs they went, 10 floors of choking smoke and collapsing walls. Marcus's vision blurred. His throat felt torn apart, but he could still hear the little girl's faint breathing. It was enough to keep him moving. By the time they reached the ground floor, the fire had spread to the lobby. Flames licked the edges of the front desk. Glass shattered under the pressure of heat. Marcus kicked open the side exit, the night air rushing in like salvation. He stumbled outside, clutching the girl tightly against his chest. The cold air hit him hard, the silence of the night broken only by distant sirens. He laid the child gently on the ground, patting her face, making sure she was still breathing. Her small chest rose and fell, alive, safe. Marcus fell to his knees beside her, coughing, trembling, his eyes watering not just from the smoke, but from the overwhelming relief that she was alive. He didn't care about the burns on his hands or the pain in his chest. He just looked at the child and whispered a silent thank you to God. Within minutes, firefighters rushed in, sirens blaring, lights flashing red and blue across the building's smoking shell. Paramedics lifted the girl onto a stretcher. One of them looked at Marcus, his uniform scorched, his arms trembling, and realized what had just happened. The firefighter's voice cut through the chaos. He saved her. But by the time cameras arrived, Marcus was gone. He didn't wait for applause or recognition. He just walked away quietly into the night, disappearing down the empty street like a shadow. He didn't know that the child he saved wasn't just any girl. She was the daughter of Ashton Industries, CEO, the very man whose company Marcus cleaned for every night. And the next morning, when the CEO learned who had saved his daughter, the world inside that corporate tower would never be the same again. The morning sun rose over Ashton Tower like nothing had happened. The glass walls reflected light into the streets below, as if the fire had been just another dream burned away by daylight. But inside the building, ashes told a different story. The once polished lobby was blackened with soot. Firefighters still moved in and out, assessing the damage, taking notes, and sealing off areas too unstable to enter. The scent of smoke lingered in every corner, a reminder of the night's horror. Marcus Hill arrived quietly at dawn, his uniform freshly washed, his face weary but calm. He didn't expect anyone to notice him. He had worked here for years, invisible to most, remembered only by his name on the cleaning roster. He thought the fire was behind him now. He had done what was right. That was enough. But something was different today. The moment Marcus walked through the front door, every eye turned toward him. Security guards nodded. The receptionist, who usually barely looked up, stared as if she had seen a ghost. And then came the whispers. "He's the one. That's him, the janitor who saved the CEO's daughter." Marcus froze mid-step. The air around him seemed to shift. He didn't know how they had found out. He hadn't told anyone. He had just gone home, washed the smoke off his skin, and prayed for the girl's safety. But the story had spread, fast. Upstairs, on the top floor of Ashton Tower, Mr. Richard Ashton, the company's CEO, was pacing in his office. The man who had built this empire was known for his iron will, a man who didn't show emotion, who measured everything in profit and loss. But today, there was something in his eyes that no one had ever seen before. Humility, gratitude, awe. His daughter was alive because of one man, a man most of his employees never even noticed. At exactly 10 o'clock, an announcement came over the building's intercom. The voice was calm but powerful. "All staff, please report to the main lobby immediately. The CEO has an important message." The employees gathered slowly, confused, curious. Secretaries, managers, executives, interns, everyone stood shoulder to shoulder around the charred, marble floor where the fire had started. The air buzzed with anticipation. And then the elevator doors opened. Richard Ashton stepped out, his expression solemn, his daughter holding his hand. She was pale but smiling, her eyes scanning the crowd until they stopped on Marcus. She broke into a small, innocent grin. Marcus felt something in his chest tighten. The CEO took a breath and began to speak. His voice echoed through the hushed crowd. He told them about the fire, how the sprinklers failed, how tragedy almost struck. He spoke of fear, chaos, and the moment he thought his daughter was gone. And then his tone changed. He told them about the man who didn't hesitate, the man who rushed through flames, the man who carried his daughter from death back into life. When he said Marcus's name, the crowd turned in unison. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the sound of applause, hesitant at first, then louder, until it filled the entire lobby. Marcus stood still, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do. He had never been the center of attention before. He didn't seek praise or recognition, but in that moment, standing there covered in humility, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: respect. The CEO walked toward him, his daughter still at his side. In front of the entire company, he extended his hand. Marcus hesitated, then slowly took it. The applause grew thunderous. Cameras flashed. Employees cheered. But then came the part no one expected. The CEO raised his voice once more. He said that from this day forward, Marcus Hill would no longer be the janitor of Ashton Industries. He paused, letting the words hang in the air, as confusion rippled through the crowd. Then he said something that made the entire company gasp. Marcus was being promoted, not just with a title, but with purpose. He was to lead a new department, workplace safety and emergency response, created because of his bravery and quick thinking. He would train others, oversee safety protocols, and ensure no fire, literal or metaphorical, ever threatened the lives within those walls again. The announcement hit Marcus like a wave. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. It felt unreal. A janitor standing in front of executives and directors, being offered leadership, recognition, respect. The CEO's daughter stepped forward and wrapped her small arms around Marcus's waist. She whispered something only he could hear. But the look in her eyes said enough. Gratitude, pure and innocent. Tears welled up in Marcus's eyes. He had faced fire, pain, and fear. But this moment burned deeper. Not with heat, but with something stronger, dignity. As the applause echoed, Marcus looked around. Many of those who once ignored him now clapped the loudest. Some looked ashamed, others inspired. In that instant, the hierarchy of the company shifted, not because of policy, but because of humanity. The CEO turned back to the crowd and announced that Marcus would start. his new position immediately. The staff cheered again, some wiping tears from their eyes. Marcus, overwhelmed, simply nodded. He didn't need to say anything. His actions had spoken louder than words ever could. But not everyone in that room was happy. In the far corner, a few executives exchanged cold glances. They whispered to each other, their smiles forced. To them, Marcus's promotion was an insult, a disruption of the order they had always believed in. A janitor elevated above them, a man of humble background sitting in meetings beside them. They couldn't accept it. And while Marcus was being celebrated as a hero, jealousy began to smolder quietly. A new kind of fire, unseen but dangerous. As the crowd dispersed and the CEO led his daughter away, Marcus looked once more at the building he had spent years cleaning. It felt different now, not just walls and glass, but a place where his name finally meant something. He didn't know that his real test was still to come. Because not all fires burn from flames. Some start from envy, pride, and hidden hatred. And soon Marcus would find himself fighting a battle far darker than the one he had faced in the smoke. The applause had faded, but its echo still lingered in the halls of Ashton Tower. Everyone was talking about Marcus Hill and the janitor turned hero, the man whose courage had rewritten the company's story overnight. His new office wasn't grand, just a small corner room on the 5th floor, overlooking the parking lot. But to Marcus, it felt like the top of the world. For the first time in years, his name was on a door. Printed in bold letters, Marcus Hill, head of workplace safety. Every morning he arrived early, still wearing the same humble smile, greeting the staff the same way he always had. Yet now those greetings were returned. People looked him in the eye, shook his hand, and spoke his name with respect. For a while, everything felt right. The CEO kept his promise. Marcus was given authority, a raise, and a seat at the weekly executive meetings. He started safety drills, rechecked the fire systems, and installed alarms that actually worked. The company was safer, stronger, and more united than ever. But behind the polished smiles and congratulatory pats on the back, something poisonous began to grow. Among those clapping hands and praising lips were men who envied him. Men who had spent years climbing the corporate ladder, only to see a janitor rise above them in a single day. And no one felt that jealousy more deeply than Peter Collins, the operations director. Peter had always seen himself as next in line for a promotion. He had the education, the charm, the reputation. But overnight, all the attention shifted to Marcus, a man Peter once passed in the hallway without even noticing. To Peter, Marcus's rise wasn't heroism. It was humiliation. At first, the resentment hid behind forced politeness. Peter smiled at meetings, shook Marcus's hand, even called him sir in front of others. But his eyes told a different story, cold, sharp, calculating. It began with whispers. He only got the position because of sympathy. Someone would mutter near the break room. Let's see how long he lasts, another would smirk. Marcus heard the murmurs, but he ignored them. He had faced fire. Words couldn't hurt him. But Peter wanted more than gossip. He wanted Marcus gone. He started planting seeds of doubt. Small lies, subtle moves, missing reports that Marcus supposedly failed to submit. Safety checks marked incomplete even though Marcus had signed them off. Peter made sure those mistakes reached the CEO's desk. When questioned, Marcus stood calm, respectful, honest. The CEO trusted him, for now. But the tension was building. Peter's influence was strong, and some of the executives had already begun to see Marcus not as a hero, but as an outsider who didn't belong. Weeks passed. Marcus worked harder, later, longer. He poured himself into his duties, determined to prove that his promotion wasn't a gift of pity, but a reward for dedication. But the weight of envy hung heavy in the air, growing thicker with each passing day. Then came the day that changed everything again. It started like any other. The morning sun reflecting off the glass walls, employees chatting in the corridors, the smell of coffee drifting from the break room. Marcus was reviewing a safety drill plan when one of the security guards rushed into his office, face pale, breath short. Something was wrong. The storage room on the 12th floor, the same floor where the fire had started weeks ago, was filled with smoke again. Marcus's heart dropped. Without hesitation, he grabbed his emergency radio and sprinted for the stairs. Fire alarms blared as he burst through the stairwell, shouting for the floor to be evacuated. By the time he reached the room, the flames were already licking the walls. But something about it didn't feel right. The fire wasn't spreading naturally. It was too contained, too controlled, almost like it had been started. Marcus grabbed a fire extinguisher, forcing the door open through the heat and smoke. He battled the flames until his lungs screamed, his arms shaking. Finally, he put it out. When the smoke cleared, he noticed something lying near the charred remains of a filing cabinet and a small gas canister. Marcus stared at it. Someone had done this on purpose. Within an hour, firefighters and company officials swarmed the floor. Cameras recorded everything. And as Marcus tried to explain what he found, Peter appeared, his expression grave, his tone dripping with fake concern. But before Marcus could speak, Peter handed the CEO a printed document. It was a security report and supposedly showing Marcus entering the storage room alone an hour before the fire started. The timestamp was clear, the image grainy but damning. Marcus froze. It wasn't true. He had been in his office the entire time. But the photo, it looked real. The crowd began to murmur. Doubt spread like smoke. The same people who had clapped for him now exchanged uncertain glances. The CEO's face was unreadable, a mix of confusion, disappointment, and disbelief. Marcus tried to explain, but Peter was faster. He painted a story of negligence, maybe even attention-seeking, suggesting that Marcus had started the fire to prove his own importance. By the end of the day, Marcus was suspended pending investigation. The same man who had saved the CEO's daughter, the man who had risked his life, now walked out of Ashton Tower under a cloud of suspicion. Cameras, once flashing in admiration, now recorded his shame. As Marcus stepped into the evening light, he felt the weight of betrayal press against his chest. He had faced fire once before and conquered it. But this time it wasn't flames that burned him. It was lies. And somewhere high above, behind glass walls, Peter Collins watched him go, a smile flickering at the corner of his lips. But what Peter didn't know was that the truth had a way of surviving, just like Marcus did. And sooner or later that truth would rise from the ashes. The days that followed were the darkest in Marcus Hill's life. For years he had walked the halls of Ashton Tower with quiet pride. Now those same halls felt like walls closing in on him. Every step he took was haunted by whispers, people lowering their voices, pretending not to stare. The man once hailed as a hero was now branded a fraud, maybe even an arsonist. Marcus spent his suspension in silence. The news had spread beyond the company walls. Local papers ran the story. Hero janitor under investigation for fire. Mishap. Reporters camped outside. His small apartment, waiting for a reaction he refused to give. He stayed home, sitting by his window every night, staring at the skyline. He had nothing to prove to the world, but the pain of betrayal cut deep. Not because people doubted him, but because the man behind the lie had once shaken his hand and called him brother, Peter Collins. Marcus didn't need proof to know who had done it. The fire, the forged evidence, the twisted story. It all carried Peter's fingerprints. If not literally, then in motive. Envy had turned to malice. But proving it would take more than truth. It would take strength, patience, and faith. Meanwhile, in the high offices of Ashton Industries, chaos brewed quietly. The CEO was torn. He wanted to believe Marcus, the man who had saved his daughter's life. But the evidence against him seemed undeniable. The security footage, the gas canister, the reports, everything pointed to guilt. And Peter, with his calm, persuasive tone, had made it sound convincing. Yet something about it didn't sit right with him. The CEO's daughter, Emma, had been asking questions. She was only 7, but her mind was sharp, and her heart remembered. She knew Marcus wasn't the kind of man to hurt anyone, let alone start a fire. Every morning before school, she asked her father the same question. "Daddy, did the nice man do something bad?" And every time, Richard Ashton found it harder to answer. Then one evening, as investigators were reviewing the fire damage on the 12th floor, something unexpected surfaced. A new technician hired to repair the damaged security system found a backup file, an untouched security log from a hidden server that hadn't been corrupted by the fire. It was buried deep in the network, forgotten. But when he opened it, He saw something the previous team had missed. A second video feed, one showing Peter Collins, entering the 12th floor storage room 30 minutes before the fire began. The technician didn't think much of it at first. He just logged it in the system following protocol. But when the file reached the CEO's office the next morning, everything changed. Richard Ashton watched the footage in silence. Peter, dressed in his usual suit, looking around nervously before setting a small object on the floor. Then a spark, a flame. And as the smoke began to rise, Peter slipped out, glancing once at the camera before it cut out. The truth hit Richard like a blow. The man he trusted, the man who had accused Marcus, was the real culprit. Anger surged through him, but so did shame. He had doubted the man who saved his child's life. He had stood silent while Marcus suffered humiliation, and now it was time to make things right. That afternoon, a meeting was called, just like before. The entire staff gathered in the main lobby, their faces filled with curiosity and unease. They had seen Marcus rise once and fall just as fast. None of them knew what to expect this time. The elevator doors opened and Richard Ashton stepped out again. But this time, there was no daughter by his side. Instead, he carried a tablet. Its screen paused on a single frame of the video. He didn't waste words. He played the footage. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Peter Collins appeared on the screen, igniting the fire that nearly destroyed the building for a second time. Gasps echoed through the hall. Eyes turned toward Peter, who stood frozen near the front, his face drained of color. Before anyone could speak, security stepped forward. Peter tried to explain, to twist the story one last time, but the evidence was undeniable. Within minutes, he was escorted out of the building in disgrace. And then, as the crowd stood speechless, the CEO said the words everyone had been waiting for. "Marcus Hill is innocent." There was silence. Then, slowly, the applause began again. Not the shallow, uncertain clapping from before, but deep, powerful, genuine. Outside, as the news spread, the cameras that once painted Marcus as a criminal now sought to celebrate him again. But Marcus didn't rush to the spotlight. He arrived quietly, the same way he had always done. When he stepped into the lobby, the entire staff turned toward him. The CEO walked over and shook his hand, his eyes heavy with remorse. He offered a public apology, not just for doubting him, but for allowing envy to fester under his leadership. And then he did something no one expected. He announced that Marcus's department would not just oversee safety, but become a cornerstone of Ashton Industries. Ethics and culture. His leadership would stand as a reminder that integrity was worth more than status. Marcus didn't speak much that day. He simply looked around, at the faces that had once turned away, now filled with respect. He didn't need revenge. The truth had spoken for him. When the crowd dispersed, he walked up to the charred remains of the old fire site. The ashes were gone, replaced by new marble tiles. Yet he could still feel the echoes, the crackling flames, the child's cry, the fear, and the courage that had begun it all. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The air smelled cleaner now, not just of smoke gone, but of justice restored. But deep in his heart, Marcus knew something more profound, that the fire had never been his enemy. It had been his teacher. The flames had tested not just his strength, but the strength of his character. And through it all, he had learned that light always rises from the ashes, even when the world tries to bury it. What Marcus didn't know, though, was that his journey wasn't over yet. For every truth revealed, there are always eyes watching from the shadows, and one final test was waiting for him. Peace returned to Ashton Tower. but not the kind that comes from silence. It was the kind built on truth, humility, and hard lessons learned through fire. Weeks had passed since the revelation that cleared Marcus Hill's name. Peter Collins was gone, dismissed, disgraced, and facing charges for arson and fraud. The whispers that once followed Marcus had vanished, replaced by a quiet reverence. People looked at him differently now, not with pity, not with surprise, but with respect. For the first time, he wasn't invisible. Marcus still arrived early every morning, the same way he always had. The only difference was that now, when he walked through the glass doors, people stood taller, greeted him warmly, and meant it. His office had been moved higher, closer to the executive wing, a small symbol of trust restored. But Marcus never let the new title change him. He still carried his old mop in the corner of his office, silent reminder of where he began. When people asked him why, he would simply smile and say, "Because that mop saw everything." Life slowly settled back into rhythm. Safety drills ran smoothly. New alarms were installed. The company thrived again. Yet for Marcus, the peace he felt went beyond the walls of Ashton Tower. It was deeper, spiritual. He spent his weekends volunteering at local shelters, teaching kids about courage and integrity. Sometimes he would visit schools, telling stories of how small choices can make the biggest difference. The children listened in awe, never realizing they were in the presence of a man who had once carried a child through fire. One afternoon, the CEO invited Marcus to his home. It was the first time Marcus had ever seen the man outside the polished world of suits and offices. Richard Ashton welcomed him not as an employee, but as a friend. His daughter, Emma, ran to greet Marcus with the same bright smile she had worn that night in the lobby. She handed him a drawing, a picture of herself, her father, and Marcus standing in front of a tall building with a golden sun above it. At the bottom, in shaky letters, she had written, "My hero." Marcus's heart swelled. He had received many thanks in his life, but none had ever felt as pure as that. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, Richard Ashton made an announcement, not the kind spoken into microphones or recorded by cameras, but one meant for a man whose deeds deserved more than headlines. He revealed that Ashton Industries had established a new scholarship program in Marcus's name, the Marcus Hill Foundation for Courage and Integrity. It would fund education for underprivileged youth, helping children from low-income families pursue careers in safety, engineering, and emergency response. The idea was simple: to create more heroes like Marcus. For a moment, Marcus couldn't speak. He looked out across the sprawling city and felt tears gather in his eyes. He had never sought recognition, never asked for anything more than a chance to serve. Yet here he was, his name now a symbol of light. The CEO thanked him once more, not just for saving his daughter, but for saving him too. He admitted that the fire had burned more than walls. It had burned away arrogance, ego, and pride. It had taught him to see people not for their titles, but for their hearts. Marcus left that evening under the quiet sky, his old car rolling down the empty road as the city lights flickered in the distance. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with his journey. The struggles, the humiliation, the tests of faith, every flame, every tear had led him here. The next morning, as he arrived at the office, the lobby gleamed again, repaired, renewed, alive. Hanging on the wall near the entrance was a framed photograph. Marcus standing beside the CEO and his daughter. Beneath it, in golden letters, were the words, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to stand through the fire." Employees stopped to look at it every day. Some smiled, some reflected quietly. And to many, it became more than a plaque. It became a promise. Marcus continued his work, humble, steady, dedicated. Years passed, and Ashton Tower became known across the country not just for business, but for its values. Other companies began adopting similar safety programs, inspired by Marcus's model. The scholarship grew, changing hundreds of young lives. Yet Marcus never saw himself as a hero. He still believed he was just a man doing what was right when it mattered most. On his final day before retirement, the company held one last gathering. The same lobby where everything had begun was filled again. The same walls, the same energy, but a very different spirit. The CEO, now older and grayer, stood beside Marcus, thanking him for his years of service. Emma, now grown, presented him with a golden plaque. It read simply, "To Marcus Hill, the man who taught us that even in the darkest smoke, goodness still shines." As applause filled the hall one last time, Marcus smiled, feeling the warmth of every soul around him. He thought back to that night. The fire, the child, the choice. He realized something profound. He hadn't just saved a life that night. He had saved an entire company's soul, and as he walked out of Ashton Tower for the final time, the evening light touched his face. Golden, soft, eternal. Marcus Hill, the janitor who became a hero, disappeared once more into the quiet of the city. But his story lived on, told by those who had seen him rise from the ashes, proof that even the humblest among us can carry the greatest fire within.